welcome back to Limb Driven TV. Today we're actually going to cover slightly a controversial topic, but it's something that I seem to get in my PMs all the time. Yes, once again we're going to hammer home a small discussion about speed and momentum and kinetic energy, and now it's going to be trad versus compounds. Which one's better? Is one more lethal than the other? What is the deal with trad versus compound? So let's break it down, and we're going to bring in real science and talk about, from a scientific perspective, is one more lethal than the others. So speed in and of itself isn't a bad thing. We're not trying to say, oh, based on whatever speed you're shooting, oh, you're not going to be lethal. That's not where we're going with it, and we're not going to go with the side of if you're slow, you're not lethal. We're really going to look at what's called force of drag and drag coefficients and how it relates to arrows. So there's a big equation that was dug up by a few buddies of mine deep in Ed Ashby's files and things that he ended up keeping track of throughout his 30 years of research. And so here's the equation. FD equals 1/2 PV squared CDA. So for those that know basic math, those are all variables, and because there's no symbols in between them besides the one exponent, those are all being multiplied. So it's a big equation that starts with 1/2 and everything else being multiplied. So you can multiply them all together and divide by 2, and that's FD. But first, we need to look at what are these variables. All these letters don't make sense unless we know what they stand for. So let's look at what they stand for. FD is the force of drag, and that's what we're trying to find. We're trying to find this force of drag because ultimately those arrows need to overcome that force of drag. P is the density of the substance that's being penetrated. V is the speed, or velocity in this case. A is just a reference area. Reference area is talking about where you end up hitting. So tissue, soft bone, and Ashby had calculations for whether it is tissue or bone and what you end up hitting and how that should be multiplied inside of this equation. So that's what that is referencing. And CD is the drag coefficient of the moving object. So this is a pretty big, complex equation, but really, if you break it down and you look at, well, what does this mean for a bow hunter? How are we going to pay attention to this? How are we going to break it down and make it useful for someone that doesn't know all of these things? Well, it's pretty easy. As you can see in the equation, V is squared. V is going to be velocity, so we're going to focus on that. And then CD is the drag coefficient of the moving object. We know that arrows are moving. They're moving fast. They're going to have different drag coefficients. These drag coefficients are important because it's going to play into how that overall calculation of force of drag is. Now, force of drag is just a fancy term for what we typically would call wind resistance or water resistance, and there's tons of other things that have resistance. But what people sometimes forget is that different parts on animals have resistance. Hide has resistance, muscle tissue has resistance, and there's a variable in there for different amounts of resistance if you're going to have a gut shot versus a shot that might end up encountering bone. These all have different resistances, and we don't have to worry about trying to calculate them simply due to this example right here that we're going to end up putting on the screen. So if we focus just on velocity and then we focus on CD, that drag coefficient, it's pretty easy to break this down. For simplicity's sake, let's just make this a whole number. So these aren't real numbers, we're not calculating the real resistance factors, but we just want to use whole numbers, and this will all make sense when we get towards the end. So let's say our drag coefficient is the number 2. So now let's look at the velocity side of things. When we look at traditional bows and we look at compound bows, it's not uncommon nowadays to have one that's shooting 300 feet per second. That's totally not uncommon. It's actually kind of turning into the norm. And when we look at traditional bows, it's not uncommon for people to be shooting slightly lower poundage bows with slightly heavier arrows than what a compound archer is going to use. It's not uncommon to have an arrow around 150 feet per second. So when we break that down, we look at a compound arrow is roughly moving 2 times as fast as a traditional bow's arrow would be moving. So let's hang on to that concept and make it into this, kind of fit it into the equation with whole numbers that are really easy to work with. So let's say that traditional bow is chucking an arrow at 2 feet per second, and the compound bow is chucking an arrow at 4 feet per second. We know that the velocity needs to be squared. So we're going to take 2 and square it. That equals 4. We're going to take 4, the speed of the compound bow, and square it, and that's going to be 16. Now, when we multiply both of those by our drag coefficient, 2, as we decided, we see that a traditional bow is going to have to overcome roughly 8 in terms of that drag coefficient when it's multiplied by velocity. And that compound bow is going to have to overcome roughly 32 in terms of that drag coefficient. When we break this down, we're seeing that so far in this equation, that compound bow is going to have to overcome 4 times the resistance of a traditional bow. One that has a higher velocity is going to have more drag than one that has a lower velocity, as long as the same medium is being penetrated. And that's important to know. And I think that's a good spot to transition now into the real argument here, like trad versus compound. Which one is more or less lethal? And really, when we look at this data, because again, compounds are typically roughly twice as fast as trad bows, and that's why we use those really simple examples to be able to outline it here for you to try and understand. When we look at it, it really just, because the resistance is so different, it's okay for a trad bow to be a little bit slower, and it's okay for that compound to be a little bit higher. Typically the compound now can have higher momentum values. We know that kinetic energy is not the end all when we're looking at in terms of penetration. When we look at how much penetration potential does a certain arrow setup have, we're not looking at kinetic energy. So we know as long as adequate momentum is sustained for that arrow until it penetrates through the animal, we know that we're good. I'll end with saying it's important to look at, obviously, the 12 penetration factors that Ashby was able to outline after his 30 plus years of research, but just to make things really simple, we want to be able to look at total arrow weight. Total arrow weight, you're going to have more penetration. We want to look at structural integrity. If you have good structural integrity, typically, if your arrow stays together, you're going to have good results. When we look at shape and profile, that's in terms of that arrow and the broadhead, and are they working together in terms of shape, profile, like mechanical advantage, types of broadheads. Are those being of benefit to you, or are they hurting you? And it's kind of outlining the difference between that fixed blade or that mechanical. So are we doing things to help us, doing things to hurt us? We can make a conscious decision with both styles of shooting as far as that goes. And the last thing being sharpness. No matter what weapon you're choosing, whether it's a trad bow or a compound, you should have sharp broadheads, and that should never be something that is sacrificed. Sharp broadheads are extremely important, whether it's a shot that ends up being marginal or a shot that ends up being perfect. No matter what, we want that sharp broadhead, good hemorrhaging happening, drop the animal's blood pressure so that they can't get too far away from you, and make it an easy track job. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know that it's a lot of science, and we broke it down, and it's a subject that some people might not see a point in discussing, and that's totally okay. But I got a lot of DMs kind of talking about a Facebook post that was on our Limb Driven TV Facebook page that was talking about this equation. So I figured I'd make a video and address it. You guys like the truth about archery, you like hearing facts and things involved in science, you should definitely hit the subscribe button. And if you like this style of video, click the like button so that we know that our viewers do like scientific videos, and we will absolutely make more. Thank you again for watching. Don't forget, hit that subscribe button. We'll see you next time.